Imagine, if you will, a force so powerful, so ruthless, that it turns an entire army into nothing more than a grave. This isn't the stuff of legends or fantasy. This is the history of traps so ingeniously deadly, they decimated entire battalions without ever firing a single shot. One of the most horrifying traps known to humankind is the terrain collapse, a ruthless strategy designed to use the earth itself as a weapon. These traps didn't just kill, they wiped out entire armies, leaving no survivors. No mercy, no warning. Just a sudden, violent collapse of the ground beneath the feet of the unsuspecting enemy, burying them in their own graves. The only remnants left were the echoes of their final moments and the soil that swallowed them whole. In the history of warfare, many armies have faced enemies that relied on deception, cunning, and the manipulation of the battlefield. But none were as effective as the traps engineered to use the very land to obliterate soldiers. These were the killers who didn't care for honor or a fair fight. They cared only for the destruction of their enemies. Today we will look at the history of such traps, their creation, and their devastating impact. From ancient civilizations to modern warfare, the use of terrain as a weapon has shaped the course of battles, defining both the tactics of war and the terrifying potential of engineering mass destruction. This is the story of the traps that turned an army into a grave. A tale of warfare, ingenuity, and death itself. A tale that will forever alter the way we view the battlefield. To understand the scale and effectiveness of these traps, we must first grasp the ingenuity and the terrifying simplicity behind them. Imagine an enemy force marching confidently toward what they believe is an open, defensible position. Unbeknownst to them, the ground beneath them has been prepared for their arrival, primed for destruction. One of the earliest examples of such a trap can be traced back to the ancient Roman Empire, where engineers were tasked with the construction of not just fortifications and walls, but also elaborate traps meant to kill thousands. But these were no ordinary traps. The Romans understood that the environment itself could be transformed into a weapon, and so they began engineering mass graves disguised as natural disasters. Yet it wasn't just the Romans who perfected this technique. Across the ancient world, the idea of using the terrain to trap an enemy became more common. The Chinese, for instance, were masters of using their vast network of underground tunnels, creating entire labyrinths designed to collapse when armies marched through. By the time they realized they were walking into a trap, the ground had already begun to swallow them. In these early days of military engineering, it was not just about battle tactics, but understanding the land itself. It wasn't enough to rely on weapons alone. The battlefield had to be transformed into a death trap. And this transformation, this ability to shape the earth itself, would have devastating consequences in the centuries to come. What exactly made these traps so devastating? At the heart of these engineered massacres lay a simple concept: terrain collapse. A seemingly innocuous patch of ground, carefully prepared, would become the deadliest weapon imaginable. These traps worked by exploiting the natural landscape, caves, caverns, or even tunnels, and manipulating them to collapse under the weight of the enemy's own soldiers. The mechanics behind these traps were both brilliant and terrifying. In many cases, large pits or underground tunnels were dug, sometimes reinforced with delicate structures that would collapse when triggered. The soldiers, marching into what they thought was a secure position, were caught completely unaware as the earth beneath them gave way, sending them into a chasm or a labyrinth of tunnels from which there was no escape. In other cases, entire sections of a battlefield were rigged with explosives, waiting to be set off when the enemy moved into position. As they advanced, the traps would be triggered by pressure plates or even remote devices, causing the ground to break apart violently. The result? Entire armies were swallowed by the earth, vanishing without a trace. The effectiveness of these traps was not in their complexity, but in their simplicity. A well-placed trap could destroy an entire battalion before the soldiers even realized what was happening. And because these traps were hidden in plain sight, the enemy would never see the danger coming until it was too late. But the impact of these traps went beyond just military strategy. They caused psychological terror, too. To fall into one of these traps was not just a defeat, it was a death sentence. The soldiers who walked into these traps knew that escape was impossible. Once they stepped onto the prepared ground, there was no coming back. They were not just trapped, they were buried alive. The use of terrain-based traps and engineered massacres isn't confined to a single period of history. From the ancient world to the modern era, the idea of using the land itself as a weapon has been a staple of military strategy. During the ancient and medieval periods, armies often relied on these traps to destroy or incapacitate their enemies. The use of pits, collapsed tunnels, and even natural landforms like quicksand or swampy areas became an effective way to eliminate soldiers who were unprepared or unwittingly walked into the wrong place. Fast forward to the 20th century, and we see a more modern iteration of the same concept: the landmines and explosive devices of the world wars. While the technology has changed, the principle remains the same. Use the terrain to trap and destroy your enemy. But no matter the era, these traps share a common thread. They exploit an enemy's overconfidence, their assumptions about the battlefield, and their failure to recognize the dangers lurking just beneath the surface. The engineering of these deadly traps was as much an art as it was a science. From the earliest days of warfare, military engineers sought ways to manipulate the environment to their advantage. And, over time, they refined these techniques, developing more sophisticated traps designed to destroy not just individuals, but entire armies. In many cases, these traps were set in key strategic locations. For example, a well-placed trap could cut off retreat or force an army into a corner, where they would be unable to escape the collapse. In some instances, engineers would study the terrain in great detail, looking for weak points in the earth that could be exploited. One of the most well-known examples of such a trap was the infamous earthquake tactic employed by ancient Chinese generals. They would dig tunnels under enemy positions, pack them with explosives, and then trigger the collapse at the precise moment that the enemy was most vulnerable. The result was a massive shock wave that swallowed entire regiments in seconds. For other cultures, such as the Romans and later the Soviets, the idea of creating traps that used natural disasters, like landslides or massive floods, became a cornerstone of military engineering. These traps weren't just about taking out enemy soldiers. They were designed to demoralize, to send a message about the ruthlessness of the attackers. The ingenuity of these traps wasn't just in their design, but in their ability to remain hidden until the moment of collapse. The ground would seem stable until it was too late, and by then, it was often impossible to escape. The real horror of these traps was the way they turned the battlefield into an arena of fear. It wasn't just about fighting. It was about surviving in a landscape where the earth itself could betray you. Soldiers didn't just die in battle. They died because the very land they fought on turned against them. As the ground caved in and swallowed everything in its path, the terror was not just about the imminent death. It was about the sense of helplessness, the inability to fight against the very terrain itself. There was no enemy to face, no force to fight back against, just the cold, inevitable collapse. As the trap is set and the enemy falls into place, the moment of collapse becomes inevitable. The ground, once a secure path, now becomes a shifting, treacherous landscape. The soldiers, unaware of the danger beneath their feet, march forward with confidence, unaware that every step they take brings them closer to their doom. One of the most infamous examples of this kind of trap took place during the ancient siege of Carthage. Roman engineers had learned from the failures of past battles and used their knowledge of terrain to craft a trap so effective it led to one of the most devastating losses of life in ancient warfare. Carthage, a city built on the edge of the Mediterranean, was a city of power, culture, and military prowess. The Romans, ever eager to expand their empire, laid siege to the city in 146 BCE. But the Romans knew they weren't just fighting the Carthaginian army. They were fighting a city built upon treacherous terrain. The engineers had seen that the battlefield around the city could be manipulated. The Romans rigged the terrain in ways that even the Carthaginian defenders didn't fully comprehend. Beneath the surface, the Romans had set explosive traps beneath the city streets. The enemy, advancing through what they thought were secure pathways, triggered the collapse. The very ground beneath them gave way, swallowing thousands in seconds, burying entire units, and leaving only a barren grave in its wake. The horror of these traps wasn't just in their immediate lethality, it was in the psychological terror that came with them. Imagine being a soldier, walking down a seemingly safe street, and suddenly the ground beneath your feet opens up. A battalion, once proud and confident, now disappears without a trace, the remnants of their army crushed beneath the earth. While the traps themselves were terrifying, it was the engineering behind them that truly made them a feat of military genius. The precision and strategy required to build such traps were unparalleled. These weren't mere random acts of violence. They were calculated, deliberate executions carried out with meticulous planning and understanding of the land. The process of setting a terrain collapse trap often began with surveying the landscape in great detail. Military engineers, trained in the art of destruction, would identify natural weaknesses in the earth. These could be areas prone to shifting, unstable caverns beneath the surface, or regions with soft soil that could be easily manipulated. Once identified, these weaknesses would be exploited. Large underground chambers would be dug, sometimes reinforced with wooden beams or stone supports. These chambers were designed to hold back the weight of the earth, ready to collapse when triggered. In some cases, mines or other explosive devices would be strategically placed to ensure the collapse was sudden and devastating. The timing of these traps was just as critical. Engineers had to calculate precisely when the enemy would cross a particular section of terrain. Too early, and the trap would be discovered. Too late, and the soldiers could escape. The perfect moment had to be chosen, often down to the very second. But when the collapse happened, it was never just about the immediate chaos of the earth swallowing soldiers. It was about survival, or, more often than not, the absence of it. Imagine being in the midst of a battle, with the sounds of clashing weapons and shouts filling the air, when suddenly the ground beneath you begins to shake. The very land you thought was solid betrays you. Soldiers, once marching in formation, now find themselves tumbling into the abyss. The walls of the earth close in around them, and what was once solid becomes a tomb. For those few who managed to survive the initial collapse, the next phase was even worse. The collapsed area often led to underground passages, where those trapped had to fight for air, for light, for any hope of escape. But in the chaos and confusion, few managed to survive. The aftermath was not just a battlefield littered with the dead. It was a graveyard, filled with the remains of soldiers who had been buried alive by the earth they fought on. This was the true horror of terrain collapse traps. It wasn't just a quick death. It was a death that came with a sense of helplessness. To know that the earth itself had conspired against you, that the very land you stood on had become your executioner, was a terror no soldier could easily comprehend. The impact of these traps went far beyond the immediate physical destruction. They left scars on the collective psyche of soldiers and nations. To face a terrain collapse trap was to face not just an enemy, but nature itself. And nature could not be defeated. The psychological toll of being part of such a massacre was profound. For soldiers who managed to escape, the fear of what had happened was insurmountable. They would carry with them the images of their comrades swallowed by the earth, never to be seen again. The fear of walking on solid ground, a fear that the next step could be the last, became a lingering trauma for many survivors. For the victors, these traps weren't just about tactical success. They were about sending a message. The enemy's fate was sealed not by a sword or a bullet, but by the earth itself. The fear instilled by such a weapon was far more insidious than any physical wound. The idea that even the ground could betray you was a fear that would haunt soldiers for years to come. While terrain collapse traps may seem like something from the distant past, their legacy lives on. In fact, the principles behind these ancient and medieval traps have evolved and found new life in modern warfare. The weapons may be more sophisticated, but the fundamental idea of using the environment to trap and destroy remains the same. In the 20th century, the rise of landmines, buried explosives, and improvised explosive devices, IEDs, reflected the continued use of the earth as a weapon. The tactics may have changed, but the goal was the same: to trap the enemy in a position where they had no escape. In modern conflicts, such as those in the Middle East, insurgents and military forces alike have made use of hidden explosive devices that mimic the terrain. These modern terrain collapse weapons often take the form of roadside bombs or buried IEDs, designed to go off when the enemy moves into position. The terrifying part of these weapons is that, like the ancient traps, they can be almost impossible to detect. The earth seems solid, unthreatening, until it isn't. And when the trap is triggered, it's often too late for the soldiers who find themselves caught in the blast. The legacy of terrain traps continues to affect military strategy, as the environment is still used as a weapon in the most insidious of ways. From the Roman Empire to the modern battlefield, the earth itself has been used as a tool of destruction. What began as primitive traps buried deep in the ground has evolved into modern weapons that continue to shape the course of warfare. These traps weren't just about killing, they were about terrorizing, about using the land itself to bring an enemy to its knees. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of these traps is that they remain a part of warfare today. The earth, in all its quiet, unassuming power, still holds the capacity to become a grave for anyone who dares to tread too heavily on it. The next time you step onto solid ground, think carefully. The earth may look still, peaceful, and safe, but beneath the surface, the traps of war still linger, ready to turn an army into a grave. While terrain collapse traps may seem like something from the distant past, their legacy lives on. The techniques used in ancient and medieval times have evolved and found new life in modern warfare. The technologies have changed, but the fundamental concept of using the environment as a weapon remains the same. In the 20th century, during the World Wars and subsequent conflicts, landmines and other devices buried in the earth reflected the continued use of nature as a tool of mass destruction. However, these modern traps were much more sophisticated and lethal. The use of mines and explosive devices. Mines and explosive devices, hidden beneath the earth, serve the same purpose as ancient traps. From the start of warfare, adversaries are forced to march on seemingly harmless ground, unaware of the deadly devices hidden within. These modern traps can be placed along roads, in forests, or even in cities, making them nearly impossible to detect. Mines, which activate at the slightest movement, compel entire armies to advance with caution, knowing that every step they take could be their last. The strategy of minimizing casualties becomes a critical part of these conditions, and even the simplest movements become life-threatening. Modern devices such as IEDs, improvised explosive devices, also continue to apply this principle. Hidden beneath the ground, they detonate from pressure, temperature, or remote control, turning invisible terrain into a trap. The concept hasn't changed. Hide the weapon, hide the death, and use the earth as a tool of destruction. The psychological aspect of modern warfare. When it comes to the psychology of war, the earth that once served as a trap now creates fear and paranoia. Soldiers on the front lines know that every movement could be their last, because they could step on something that will kill them in an instant. Traps buried in the ground force anyone who enters the battlefield to live in constant tension, not knowing when or where the next death will strike. Modern wars continue to use psychological pressure based on the instinct for survival. Combined with advanced technology and long-range explosive devices, armies are forced to be on guard, not just from direct attacks, but from an invisible enemy hidden within the land itself. Comparing ancient and modern traps. Ancient traps, like modern mines, had one crucial element in common. They both used the land as a weapon. In ancient times, these were pits, traps filled with poisons, or even the collapse of the earth, created by engineers. The modern versions include high-tech explosive devices that can be hidden anywhere in the landscape, ensuring the same effect: sudden death and total destruction. However, the difference lies in the fact that modern technology allows for far more precise control over when and how a trap is triggered. The use of remote control, hidden sensors, or simply more sophisticated detonation technology allows for a quicker reaction to enemy movements, leaving them at the mercy of death at any moment. Modern military conflicts, such as those in Iraq, Afghanistan, or Syria, have demonstrated how effectively these methods are used. While these are no longer the ancient traps made with simple engineering techniques, the principle remains the same: using the earth as a weapon, where the enemy has no chance to detect a danger until it is too late. Consequences and moral aspects. The use of such traps has not only tactical but also moral consequences. Even in modern military contexts, the use of traps and mines rarely elicits enthusiasm from soldiers or commanders. Throughout history, there have been many debates about how such tactics should be employed. After all, they represent a form of warfare that goes beyond the typical battle. When entire armies are wiped out using hidden traps or mines, the question arises as to how military leaders and nations perceive these methods as part of the law of war. In many countries, the use of such weapons as landmines has been banned due to their devastating impact on civilian populations and the long-term consequences for the environment. This also raises questions about the humanity of conducting war. Should such technology be used when it leads to indiscriminate destruction, not just of soldiers, but of civilians? All of this calls into question the morality of using these engineering monstrosities in warfare. The traps that use the earth as a tool of death have left their mark on history. From ancient times to modern warfare, they have altered the course of battles, remaining a powerful psychological weapon. And while we may have moved beyond the use of these methods in their original form, their legacy is alive. This is not just a story about weapons. It's a story about fear and rage, with the earth itself as the constant accomplice. Today, when we look at modern wars, we see that these traps, while looking different, continue to live on in new forms. They may be hidden in the earth, in minefields, or even in technologies we don't always notice. But they are always waiting for their moment, when the shadow of war will once again cover the land, and the earth will once again demand its sacrifice. With every step we take on this earth, we must remember, beneath us, in the shadow of history, traps may still lie in wait to turn an army into a grave.